Hey guys, my name's James and welcome to the third video in a series that I'm making on the use of magic. This one will be a simple look at the Pyromancy in the game, with some strengths, weaknesses and useful situations to cast. It'll be fairly basic stuff to begin with, but hopefully you'll find it useful. Enjoy the video. Firstly we have the fireball spells, which are the standard projectile for Pyromancy, dealing fire damage in a small area dependent on which variant you use. A fireball, fire orb and great fireball deal splash damage upon impact, and Great Chaos Fireball deals splash damage along with lasting lava damage. These spells are thrown, so do not have the range of a lightning spear or soul arrow, and are most effective when free aimed, and in my opinion take a little bit more skill to use. Like all Pyromancy, these spells only depend on attunement slots and cast speed, meaning that they can be used on almost any build. However, the damage does scale from both intelligence and faith, so are most effective on builds that have invested in these stats. Next up we have Firestorm, Fire Tempest and Chaos Storm. These are the basic area spells for Pyromancy, and arguably the best in the game, as the multiple pillars make it almost impossible to roll through and punish. These spells are very damaging, and because of the multiple hits are very effective at taking down most bosses, provided you can get a safe opportunity to cast. Against other players online, this is a great spell to use in a small area, so as to minimise the chance of them dodging, and also it's great right after a riposte as a wake up spell. It will also cause a knockdown on a hit that isn't blocked, so as long as this happens you are safe from a follow-up attack. The only downside to these spells is they lock you in one position for the duration of the spell, meaning if you don't hit someone they can easily punish you with a ranged attack, such as a bow or even something more powerful like a sunlight spear or soul geyser for massive damage. This is also a downside when casting the spell against a boss, as it won't always stun them and you'll often be attacked before the spell is over. At present, Fire Tempest and Chaos Storm are very similar, with the exception of Chaos Storm leaving lava damage. The July patch looked to set this back to how it was in Dark Souls 1, with Tempest creating the most pillars, making each spell equally as useful in different situations. Moving on we have Combustion and Great Combustion. These deal fire damage right in front of your player within melee range. They're both fairly short and best used defensively, especially against other players online. Both spells take one slot, the only difference is that Great Combustion has less uses, along with being more powerful and longer range, like the normal rule for magic. Both are pretty good for the single player as a substitute for a melee attack, especially on a pure caster, and Great Combustion is great online against other players as it will generally deal more damage than most swings from a weapon. This next one is called Fire Whip, which is another close range Pyromancy that can be used slightly more aggressively than Combustion due to its tracking. This will deal multiple hits of fire damage to anything caught in the cast, and it will stun enemies online along with most of the smaller enemies in the single player. The damage on this spell is really nice, but the real strength is the tracking. As you can see here, the whip follows anyone close to you, which makes it much less open to punish than other spells of its kind. Next up we have Poison and Toxic Mist. These both create a poison cloud or whatever you are locked onto. They both only require one slot, except Toxic Mist deals more damage and has more uses, so if you have the option of both there is no reason not to choose this one over Poison Mist. The two of them do stack, and as you see here, if you do manage to hit both you'll kill someone very quickly unless they can kill this. Now there aren't too many situations in a single player where this spell will be overly useful, and players online can easily sidestep the cloud in open spaces, so the strength in this one lies in small areas where dodging isn't an option, or also to mask an area so that you can follow up with another attack without being seen. Moving on we have Acid Surge, which is the same cloud animation as the previous mist spells, except this one breaks equipment. Now this is useless in a single player, but it does have its uses online against other players. It deals no damage like the other two mists, but as I'm sure most players will agree, it's much more of an inconvenience to go and repair broken equipment at a blacksmith than it is to just suffer a loss online. So whilst most players may run through Poison Mist, take the damage and attack you, a lot of the time people will stay well away from this one to avoid equipment breaking. So again, this is good for a diversion or a mask to start combos in a small area, and if you do manage to break someone's item with this, the first thing to go usually is the third dragon ring if your opponent is wearing it because of its low durability. And if their build is relying on this ring for their roll speed, you can massively change the direction of a fight just by landing this spell and breaking one item. Next is a spell called Lingering Flame. This one requires two slots and places a small proximity mine fireball in front of you that explodes when a hostile gets close. You can cast more than one of these to amplify the damage, so if somebody's hit, it'll do massive damage depending on how many you've cast. but the duration isn't great, so most of the time you're only going to manage 3 or 4 before they start disappearing. This spell will be good in most areas in the single player to cast on its own and then lure enemies towards it with a bow or something else long range, since they'll likely walk straight into it without dodging. For fighting other players online, this is one of my favourite spells because just like Homing Soul Mass and Affinity, it can be used to control a fight. Now anyone who fights other players online regularly will know that occasionally in duels there is breathing space where both players back off and there's a bit of room to actually cast something or use a buff or something else, and this is your time to cast Lingering Flame, because whilst it's a fairly easy one to roll through the damage, it still means they have to roll, which gives you a good stamina advantage and leaves you free to attack them just after they finish the roll. So the more of these in the dueling area the better. You can also use this defensively just to stand near while you use ranged attacks or a bow, and even though someone can run over and trigger it and roll through the damage, it will stop them using running attacks on you, especially with a heavy weapon or a halberd where they do that triple spin. Moving on, we have Flame Swath. This creates a delayed explosion at the locked on target, and like most Pyromancies can be free aimed pretty well too. This track's much worse than the fireball spells and is arguably easy to dodge in open area, but is also much less of an obvious cast, especially if you free aim it right behind someone and they won't be able to see the animation. The obvious weakness to this one is open areas, but it is a good choice against most bosses due to the high damage, and the best use I can think of against other players is to get them to move. So by this I mean if they're hiding in a small room or hallway with some kind of attack that suits that location, you can throw this spell in there to make them panic and get out of the way. The final use for this one is you can cast it in between a parry and riposte for massive extra damage if you're fast enough to pull it off, but I'll go more into that in the combos video. Next up is Forbidden Sun. This one launches a huge fireball straight in front of you that arcs slightly downwards and can be free aimed up or down, but tracks very badly left and right. Unless you have a high achievement stat or a set equipment load to boost castings, this one takes up 3 slots for just one use, making it a very bad choice for the single player. Against other players online, this is not an effective spell at long range because it can easily be sidestepped, but it is great up close used as a defensive spell because of its quick cast. A good use for this would be if somebody's running at you for a run attack, you can stand there and trade the damage, you'll likely outdamage them and also stun them. Another good use for this is straight after a guard break, you can cast this and stun them, hit them with the lava damage and follow it with another attack. Here we have Flame Weapon, which is a weapon buff for Pyromancy that adds fire damage to whatever you cast it on. This one requires no stat investment other than 1 slot it requires to cast, making it the most efficient weapon buff and one of the most efficient spells in the game. The only drawback to any buff is that when you swap out the weapon you cancel the buff, so whilst there are no major downsides to extra damage, it does sometimes tell other people online that you're likely not going to be changing weapons and almost be slightly predictable with the weapon you've casted on. Next up is Iron Flesh, which is a self buff that increases defense and poise at the cost of movement and rolling. I won't go into the poise mechanic of this game too much here, but you'll see that it doesn't prevent stuns like back in Dark Souls 1, it just reduces the duration of the stun so you recover much faster. This spell could be pretty viable in a single player for earlier playthroughs, but the lack of being able to roll will get you killed very quickly in new game 4 or 5 onwards. This spell would be best used against other players online. Now I know that some of you will know that when 2 players are locked together mashing the R1 or RB button, each player stuns each other and you just kind of stand there bouncing away until somebody decides to roll away from the trade-in. Well, with this buff active, your stun would recover much faster and you'd be able to gain the advantage as a tank, and you'd also be safe to use heavy armour since rolling wouldn't be an issue. Now the obvious downside to this one against players online is your mobility, so with not being able to roll, backstep, run, jump, anything like that, you will be restricting yourself against someone else, especially if they have magic or any kind of ranged option. Moving on to Warmth. This creates a healing ball that restores health to anything near it. It's a very efficient way for a non-faith user to restore health, but care must be taken as it will heal invaders, single player enemies and even bosses if they go near it. So be sure to think about this one where you cast it. In a single player it would be good to cast this in a corner of a boss room so that you and friendly phantoms can run to it for healing without risk of healing the boss. For invaders it's best used near enemies so that the host cannot take advantage of it or move you away from the area. And against other players online in a straight up duel, this can create a control point that both players usually end up fighting over, which changes the pace of a duel in a big way. So all in all, a very versatile spell that's got many uses. Next is Immolation, which is a self buff that sets the caster on fire, dealing constant damage to yourself and anyone nearby. This one relies on staying close to an opponent, so it would be fairly ideal for a slow boss fight where you can stay close reliably. Against another player online however it's not very useful, as you have to be very close for damage to hit, so they'll just back away, and even when you do the damage isn't great. It has just received a small improvement with a recent patch, but unfortunately it cannot be stacked with other useful buffs like replenishment or iron flash to balance it out, so for the most part it's not a great choice against other players. Finally, for Pyromancy we come to Flash Sweat, which is a simple self buff that raises fire resistance. There's no real downside to this one at all, and against other players online it's great if you get the chance to cast it, especially against a Pyromancy enemy. Before you get any ideas, it doesn't stack with the previous spell Immolation, so you can't use those together. In a single player this is great against any fire using opponent and will especially help at the Iron Keep when accessing the items on the lava pass. Alright guys, that's it for Pyromancy. Although a basic guide, I hope this has been useful in some way to you all. Stay tuned for the next in this series, which will be a simple look at the hexes in the game, followed by a guide on magic combos and advanced techniques for a pure caster. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Goodbye.